The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up two bipartisan resolutions. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements for the record and any extraneous materials on today's business that you want to include there. As you were all notified yesterday, we intend to consider today's measures en bloc. And so without objection, the following items previously provided to members will be considered en bloc and are considered as read. House Resolution 348, supporting the right of the people of Ukraine to freely elect their government and determine their future. And with it, Cicilline Amendment 200 in the nature of a substitute to House Resolution 348, and Cicilline's second-degree amendment 58 to the ANS. Then we have House Resolution 354, expressing the sense of the House regarding the safety and security of Jewish communities in Europe, and Smith Amendment 201 in the nature of a substitute to the House Resolution 354. And after recognizing myself and the ranking member, I'll be pleased to recognize any member seeking recognition to speak on either of these measures. So first, I want to thank Representative Cicilline for introducing this resolution and for his commitment to the people of Ukraine. In 2014, Mr. Cicilline, along with Ranking Member Engel and committee members Poe and Lowenthal and Frankel and me, traveled to Ukraine. We traveled to as far east as we could fly, to Dnipropetrovsk, which is the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. And we heard the stories from the perspectives of the local Russian-speaking Ukrainians about this conflict. And what they told us was that Russia was trying to recruit every skinhead and malcontent and bring them there. But they said the accent is different, so those with a Muscovite accent, we're arresting them, we're holding them in the brig until the cessation of hostilities. But they said what we're really concerned about is not these Russian interlopers. What we're worried about are the Russian forces when they take the patches off, you know, and Russian armies. So what we need are anti-tank weapons. What we need is the ability to buy equipment that if they attack Dnipropetrovsk, which is on the border of Luhansk, if they attack us in the Donetsk region, then we'll be able to defend. And today, Russian aggression against Ukraine remains a daily reality along that border region. The ongoing conflict has taken the lives of 8,000 Ukrainians. Moscow continues to provide weapons and support to the separatists who control large areas of eastern Ukraine. They feel they can deal with the separatists, but they feel that their problem is the regular Russian army that's in that theater. The so-called Minsk Agreement lays out a series of steps to bring peace to the region, including holding local elections in Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has scheduled those elections for October 25th, but they will not be held in those areas of eastern Ukraine that are controlled by Russian-led separatists because free and fair elections are not possible in Luhansk and Donetsk. However, the elections will go forward in the rest of the country with independent observers to ensure they meet international standards, and this resolution strongly supports the right of the people of Ukraine to freely elect their government, urges the administration to expedite assistance for reforms to promote free and fair elections, and condemns efforts by outside forces, especially the Russian government, from interfering in those elections. And lastly, we turn to House Resolution 354 regarding the safety and security of Jewish communities in Europe. Anti-Semitism in Europe has been on the rise. The horrific loss of life that occurred in the Paris and Copenhagen attacks highlights the urgent need for European governments to better protect their Jewish communities. This timely resolution urges those governments in Europe to consider several common-sense steps aimed at improving the safety of Jewish citizens there, such as establishing partnerships between law enforcement and Jewish community groups in order to improve security plans, and including training and the law enforcement response to anti-Semitic violence. The measure also encourages European nations to improve communication among themselves, as well as with the U.S., and to analyze trends in anti-Semitic crimes and to share best practices in combating extremism. And I thank Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey for authoring this important measure and for his longtime commitment to promoting religious freedom around the world. I now recognize the ranking member for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this markup. Let me say that I agree with every word you said, so I want to put my thoughts with yours. I know we're short on time, so I'll enter my full statement into the record and issue it to the press, but I fully support these measures, and I'm particularly happy that our committee once again is advancing good bipartisan legislation as we've done so often. So I ask unanimous consent that my statement be part of the record. I wish everyone a happy holiday weekend, and I yield them.
And thank you, Mr. Engel. We go now to Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for bringing HRES 354 before the committee for markup and for your leadership on human rights issues in general and in combating anti-Semitism in particular. Mr. Chairman, violent anti-Semitic attacks between 2013 and 2014 doubled, and in some countries, in European countries, actually quadrupled. HRES 354 focuses on essential actions needed to prevent, mitigate, and respond to deadly anti-Semitic attacks like those in Paris, Copenhagen, and Brussels. Specifically, it urges the U.S. government to encourage our European allies to ensure they formally recognize, partner with, and exchange information with Jewish community security groups in their countries. There are excellent examples of this in the United States, the United Kingdom, and in France, so these best practices need to be replicated. The resolution highlights the importance of European governments supporting several key assessments and adjusting their strategies and efforts to combat anti-Semitism accordingly. It emphasizes the importance of European governments developing public awareness and suspicious activity campaigns like If You See Something, Say Something initiative, helping Jewish communities developing baseline safety standards and integrating efforts to combat violent extremism and ones to combat anti-Semitism as appropriate. HJRES 354 stresses relevant training for law enforcement, implementing declarations, decisions, and commitments related to anti-Semitism in the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and ensuring European governments have mandated and resourced senior officials to lead their anti-Semitism efforts. Finally, the resolution affirms support for the mandate of the U.S. Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, a position that I actually offered the amendment to create some years ago, and urges the Secretary of State to continue strong U.S. reporting on anti-Semitism. HRES 354 is a blueprint for actions that are critical for the safety and security of Jewish communities in Europe and for our government's engagement with our European allies to combat anti-Semitism. The specific actions recommended here are based on consultations with leading security experts who worked closely with European Jewish communities. This resolution has broad bipartisan support. It's co-sponsored by 84 members of Congress, including 23 members of this committee. All of my fellow co-chairs of the Bipartisan Task Force on Combating Anti-Semitism were original co-sponsors, including Ranking Member Eliot Engel, Eliana Ross-Layton, Ted Deutsch, who are members of this committee, and Nita Lowey, Kay Granger, Peter Roskam, and Steve Israel. It also has the strong support from many of the Jewish organizations. I yield back, and again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for your strong support and co-sponsorship of House Resolution 348, and thank you for scheduling a markup on both of these bills today. House Res 348 signals strong congressional support for free elections in Ukraine, and I thank my many colleagues on the committee who have signed on as co-sponsors as well. The democratic and economic development of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression remains one of the most vital efforts the United States can undertake to combat Russian intransigence and show our unwavering commitment to promoting democracy and human rights around the world. The illegal and forcible occupation of Crimea and the ongoing Russian support for separatists in eastern Ukraine are an affront to international law and diplomacy. The Minsk II agreement was an historic step toward potentially ending the violence and unrest in the country, and is now upon the governments of Ukraine, Russia, and the United States and our European allies as implementing partners to ensure its successful execution. A vital part of that implementation will be to hold free and fair elections throughout Ukraine, including under the terms of the agreement eventually in the Donbas region controlled by Russian-led separatists. Ukraine has local elections scheduled for most of the country except some separatist-controlled areas for October 25th. This resolution demonstrates this Congress's unwavering commitment to supporting the right of the people of Ukraine to freely elect their government and determine their future. It condemns any Russian attempts to interfere in Ukraine's elections in any way, including through intimidation, violence, or coercion. During Ukraine's last elections, these tactics were used to prevent Ukrainians from voting in certain regions. This cannot happen again, and any actions undermining these elections must be met with swift and uncertain international condemnation. At this delicate juncture in Ukraine's history, it's essential that the United States and our European allies continue to demonstrate steadfast support for Ukrainian territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the right of the Ukrainian people to participate in a free and fair electoral process. Again, I thank my colleagues for their support and urge them to support this resolution. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend you for bringing this legislation before the committee today. Russian aggression continues to violate Ukraine's political and economic sovereignty, and unfortunately, it's gone largely unrebuked around the world. If stability and peace is ever to be reestablished in Ukraine, it's vital that the people of Ukraine have the freedom to choose their own representatives, as well as take the necessary steps to ensure that their own future, without the coercion and vicious tactics orchestrated by Putin, is possible. As the shining example of freedom and democracy, America has a duty to support Ukrainians seeking constitutional reform and free and fair elections. This measure recognizes those realities and reasserts our support for the Ukrainian people to freely elect their own government. It's a timely measure. I urge its adoption, and I yield back.
We go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for adding HRES 348 to this markup. And I want to thank the authors of the resolution. This committee has spoken loudly about not only Ukraine, but about Crimea as an integral part of the Ukraine, and that we are not conceding. I'm glad to say that the Non-Recognition Act on the Ukraine has in fact been incorporated into the Defense Authorization Bill. It is vital that we speak firmly and we back it up with sanctions and other measures so that Vladimir Putin never gets the wrong impression about our acquiescence in a violent military action that subverted the sovereignty of another country. We will not accept that, ever. And I think it's really important this committee continue to speak with one voice and as firmly as possible on a bipartisan basis, and indeed we have. So I thank Mr. Cicilline in particular for his leadership on this resolution and look forward to voting for it. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Mr. Engel, the ranking member, for your leadership as well.
And we go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Well, I hate to be the skunk at the lawn party here, but let me just note that I do support the basic goal of this legislation, which is to reaffirm that we believe as Americans the democratic process should be followed in Ukraine, and that we are upset that, and we know the great challenge there that they have, and certainly the first two whereases strongly support the right of the people of Ukraine to freely elect their government and determine their future. Yes, of course. Urge the administration to expedite assistance to Ukraine to facilitate the political, economic, and social reforms necessary for free and fair elections to meet international standards. Yes, and there's no doubt about that. We want to end the conflict and upheaval that's going on that is so detrimental to all of the people of Ukraine and destabilizing to Europe. And so this puts us on record. Unfortunately, we can't seem to go on record doing that without, again, giving Russia a kick in the pants and basically ignoring what started the destabilization of Ukraine in the first place. We have here that basically we blame it. Yes, Yanukovych was president, whereas he fled the country. Doesn't start there. Doesn't start with Yanukovych fleeing the country. This whole episode that has destabilized Ukraine started when violence instigated by internal Ukrainian opposition as well, and they were in coordination and consultation with other foreign powers, meaning our European friends, created violence, a violent situation that led to the destabilization of an elected government. Yanukovych, we can close our eyes all we want, we can pretend this is all Russia. Yanukovych was an elected government. There was huge violence that was caused when he made a major policy decision. Instead of letting the election take care of it, they had massive, not just demonstrations, but we're talking about massive violence. And I know that there's been effort trying to make, oh no, that was just Yanukovych attacking the demonstrators. That was not what happened. We now have every evidence. I met with a group of Ukrainians just a couple nights ago. Clearly, what we have was violence against an elected government, and Mr. Smith was there to see that Yanukovych was elected in a fair election, and instead of waiting for the next election, our European friends had to collude with forces inside of Ukraine to create a destabilization of an elected government. Now, the bottom line is that's not even touched on here. Everything is Russia's fault. Well, yes, when Yanukovych fled and the elected government was overthrown, the fact is the Russians did act, and I oppose that. I think when the Russians sent troops in, that was wrong. We have every reason to condemn that. The Russians should not have sent troops in. And yes, we need to call upon what we have here is to make sure that we are on the side of free elections and that we want to help the Ukrainians, but then we condemn the part of outside forces, specifically the government of Russia, ignoring the fact that other governments have been involved in overthrowing an elected government. Either we should leave that out or we should include, or we should just say attempts by outside forces and leave out this little jab at Russia. We're not going to make anything better by continuing to jab Russia rather than looking at ways we can cooperate to end the conflict in Ukraine. Again, let's reach out. That's what happened in the Minsk Agreement, which the chairman already mentioned. The Minsk Agreement sets out a plan. Well, let's work with and the Russians agreed to it. Let's work with them to see how we implement the plan rather than kicking them in the pants. Well, I'm going to be opposing this, but I do think the actual goal of this, which is to try to say we're behind free elections and want Ukraine to come out of it, that certainly is a worthy goal. This, it's not going to achieve that. It's going to actually achieve the opposite, because in Russia, it will be looked at as a slap in the face. Why should we ever cooperate with these bums who are blaming it all on us and forgetting the fact that an elected government in Ukraine was overthrown? So with that said, I stand in opposition, and I stand in favor of the spirit of what you're trying to accomplish, but in this will not achieve your goal and go the opposite direction.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We go now to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a little change of pace here. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I am a co-sponsor, a proud co-sponsor of both resolutions. I thank the authors. And first, I want to just say, in terms of House Resolution 348, that I found our trip to Ukraine was very enlightening and really highlighted the necessity for the free and fair elections in order for Ukraine to regain its stability. As to House Resolution 354, and Mr. Smith, I do thank you again for that, and I do want to make a few remarks, because I want to add my concern for the safety and security of Jewish communities in Europe. The rise of anti-Semitic incidents throughout Europe in recent years is deeply troubling. In the past 2 years, terrorists have murdered Jews in the capital cities of Belgium, Denmark, and France. Jews and Jewish institutions, synagogues, and schools across Europe have suffered numerous violent attacks. As a result of this threatening environment, according to polls done by the ADL and other reputable organizations, more than 40% of Jews in Belgium, France, and Hungary are considering emigration. Journalists, scholars, and politicians are debating whether there can be a future for the Jewish community in Europe where Jews are afraid to attend events and holy sites, and where, again, according to ADL, 20% of European Jews have experienced at least one incident of anti-Semitic physical attack or harassment. Fortunately, educated observers believe that today's events in Europe are not analogous to the 1930s Germany. Then, the hatred, the persecution, and extermination of Jews was state-sponsored. In contrast, today's leaders across Europe are working to stem the tide of anti-Semitism. Key European leaders have spoken out against anti-Semitism and have taken concrete actions to fight it. With that said, however, I agree with those who believe that this is a defining moment for Europe. Our European partners and allies' ability to confront anti-Semitism will ultimately impact the very essence of the character of their nations. And as the French Prime Minister stated, if Jews flee in large numbers, the soul of the French Republic is at risk. France will no longer be France. And that is one of the reasons, of course, why House Resolution 354 is so important. We must support European governments, law enforcement agencies, and other entities to bolster Jewish security and preparedness, tighten communications with Jewish communities, and combat violent extremism broadly with counter-radicalization and education. And ultimately, helping Europe stem the rising tide of anti-Semitism means helping European nations fulfill the principles of democracy, human dignity, openness, and pluralism, and the noble principles upon which these nations were founded. I yield back.
Thank you. We go now to Congressman Poe.
I thank the chairman. I appreciate the words of my friend from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, but I see this completely different. The Russian bear invaded Georgia, gobbled up 1/3 of the territory, and it's still in Georgia. Still hungry for more land, it went into Crimea, took it, claims it's its own, and then still on the move, the bear went into eastern Ukraine, where it is now. And we all know that Russia now is in Syria, based on some faulty excuse. Ukrainians have the right of self-determination. This resolution says the Ukrainians will decide what their government's going to be, not the Russians. Contrary to what Putin says, the Napoleon of Siberia, Ukraine should decide about Ukraine, not him. So I think it's a good thing that the United States, a country that believes in self-determination and democracy, support the Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, in their quest for really not just elections, but to be rid of the invaders from Russia. I think we ought to do more for Ukraine than the United States has done. Besides sending them meals ready to eat, we ought to help them defend their own sovereignty against Russia, which is another issue. This resolution is a good idea. America stands for democracy and self-determination, even for Ukrainians. So I totally support it. Glad I'm a co-sponsor, and I appreciate the chair and ranking member bringing this up before the committee for a vote.
Thank you,
I yield back.
Thank you, Judge. We go now to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
I want to comment about both bills. I disagree with a portion of what Dana Rohrbacher had to say for reasons everybody else has already expressed. I agree with a portion of what he said. He's right on the history, and that is a Democratic elected government reneged on a giant promise, and instead of distributing campaign leaflets, there was a regime-threatening presence of large numbers of people. woe be to our state and federal governments if 1 million people will demand extra constitutional governmental changes each time politicians renege on a promise. It has happened here, I'm told. There's one part of the resolution that I think we can all agree on, and it may mean more if read in an American context. We say we strongly support the right of the people of Ukraine to freely elect their government. I turn to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, and would say, as a Texan, would you think that Texans were free to elect their government if your governor was appointed by President Barack Obama rather than elected by the residents of Texas? Would that be unpopular with the people in your district?
It'd be unpopular. It'd be against the law in our state. So we would follow what our law is. We'd let the Ukrainians make up their mind what their law is.
I would say that, and at the same time, we have a federal system here in which people are free to elect their own governor, and that has served us well and perhaps would serve as a model for the Ukraine. And certainly when Americans say in a resolution free to elect their own government, most ordinary Americans would think that that would include electing your own governor.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I'll yield for a question.
So this, I understand they're going to have their election, and that they have not agreed to permit their governors to be elected. The local government will now be appointed.
I'm not sure that that has been determined, but there are certainly some in Kiev who thinks that the local governor should be appointed, and I've urged our Ukrainian friends, especially in a country with such regional differences, just as our country has regional differences. But the exact, you're going to have to turn to other experts.
That should be in this bill, Mr. Chairman. That should be in this bill.
I'll reclaim my time because I want to talk about the anti-Semitism resolution. We would have more credibility talking to the world about anti-Semitism if it wasn't so prevalent on at least a few American campuses. On some of our campuses, federally funded in large part, you're told that you're not qualified to serve in student government unless you agree that Israel should be abolished and the Middle East should be ethnically cleansed of Jews. Now, we do have a civil rights law, and Title VI requires that anti-Semitism, those on campus not face anti-Semitism. But for anti-Semitism to be fought, you need a definition of anti-Semitism. The State Department has a definition of anti-Semitism. When we criticize other countries for allowing anti-Semitic behavior or engaging in anti-Semitic behavior, that's the definition we use. And I would hope that members of this committee would join me in writing to the U.S. Department of Education and saying it certainly undercuts our foreign policy when we tell other countries this is the definition of anti-Semitism. You should not allow or you should protect Jews from this anti-Semitic behavior if we can't get the U.S. Department of Education to agree with the same definition. For us to have any credibility in the world on this issue, the U.S. Department of Education needs to enforce the law, and the first step in enforcing the law is defining the law. So I hope to have a few co-signers for a letter, and I yield back.
Do any other members seek recognition? Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs. Oh, Mr. Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Engel for bringing these two resolutions forward. And I support H.R. 348. The Cold War is back. The President is largely insouciant towards Russian aggression. Someone has to stand for freedom, and I hope that Russia is irritated by this resolution, but I suspect that they'll be just largely amused. I also support H.R. 354. Anti-Semitism is rampant. Mr. Sherman, I'll be happy to sign that letter. It is a problem on our college campuses. And I think calling attention to the problem of Jewish safety and security is necessary, and just want to go on record as also strongly supporting H.R. 354. I yield back.
Any other members seeking recognition? Hearing no further requests, the question occurs on the items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the measures considered en bloc are agreed to. And without objection, House Resolution 348 and House Resolution 354 are ordered favorably reported as amendment, and the staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes. Also, without objection, the chair is authorized to seek House consideration of those measures under suspension of the rules. And that concludes our business for today. I thank Ranking Member Engel and all of our committee members for their contribution and assistance to today's markup. The committee is adjourned.
Thank you.